When most people think about forensic science, their minds go straight to DNA testing, fingerprints, all those things we see on TV. But the sources you brought in, they take us way beyond those usual suspects, which is kind of cool. We're talking about forensic archaeology, even pollen analysis. Like, who knew that was a thing? And then you get this whole other angle with hackers and digital fingerprints. Seems like you're fascinated by the unexpected, the lesser-known tools that crack a case wide open.
And what I find so interesting about this field is it's not just about the science itself, it's how we as humans use it. Because even with all the high-tech gadgets and advancements, that human element, it's still so crucial to the investigation, for better or sometimes for worse.
Yeah, that's actually what surprised me when I was looking through everything. I mean, I always knew investigators were sharp, but I had no idea how much our own brains can trick us up, even in forensics. For instance, there's this whole concept called illusory correlation. The Handbook of Forensic Psychology, it really dug into that.
It's like this weird quirk of how our brains work, right? Like this deep-seated need to find patterns, to make connections, even if those connections aren't actually there. And in forensic investigations, well, that could be a real problem. Investigators might start seeing links between pieces of evidence that are just, well, coincidence.
It's like that saying, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. We jump to the obvious answer, even if it's not the whole story.
Exactly. And that's often made even worse by something called selective thinking. It's where we latch onto anything that confirms what we already believe, but we ignore the stuff that contradicts it, like trying to force a puzzle piece into the wrong spot just because we want it to fit there.
Makes you wonder how many cases have taken these crazy turns because of these inherent biases.
Yeah.
It really highlights how important it is to stay open-minded, keep asking questions, not just assume.
Absolutely. And that's why a good grasp of logic, of how to reason things out, is so important. That Handbook of Forensic Psychology I mentioned, it talks a lot about these common logical fallacies that can trip up even the most seasoned investigators.
One that always gets me is that post hoc fallacy. It's like that old saying, if a black cat crosses your path, you'll have bad luck. Just because two things happen, one after the other, doesn't mean the first thing caused the second.
Exactly. There's an example in the book where someone claims they had a vision, right? A vision of a body being found near this specific tree. And guess what? Later on, they do find a body near that tree. Now, to some, that might seem like proof, but you have to remember, correlation isn't causation. There could be a million other reasons why that body ended up there.
It's a good reminder that we can't just go on gut feelings for some story we heard, a real investigation. It needs controlled studies, hard evidence, and a good dose of skepticism. But speaking of things that make you go, this is where our deep dive takes a turn for the truly unexpected. Archaeology. Turns out it plays a bigger role in solving crimes than you might think, and not in the way you'd expect either.
Yeah, when someone says archaeology, I'm thinking like ancient ruins, lost cities, not exactly a crime scene. But the stuff you shared, it shows how much forensic archaeology has changed how we investigate the past, even the really recent past, which is fascinating.
It really makes you realize how much information is right there, buried beneath our feet. And it's not just about finding bodies anymore. Forensic archaeologists, they can uncover hidden activity, figure out how people moved around a scene, even piece together what happened leading up to a crime. One thing that really surprised me was, those police line searches, the ones you always see on TV? Turns out those can actually mess up a crime scene.
Yeah.
Like they might accidentally step on or even completely miss crucial evidence because they're not trained to look for it.
That's why these forensic archaeologists, they're so incredibly careful. They use these detailed maps, they analyze the landscape, and they excavate everything so meticulously, making sure to document every single thing so no evidence gets lost.
And speaking of meticulous, get this, we're talking about pollen. Pollen. It can actually be used to solve crimes. Who knew?
Oh, absolutely. Palynology, it's called the study of pollen, might seem kind of obscure, but it's seriously valuable for investigations. Those pollen grains, they're like tiny little time capsules. They can last for centuries, sticking to clothes, hiding in the soil, even trapped in the nooks and crannies of a car. It's amazing.
So you're saying each location, it has like its own pollen fingerprint?
Exactly. Every single plant species has a unique pollen signature. So by analyzing the pollen found at a crime scene, or maybe on a suspect's clothes or something, these palynologists, they can link people or objects to specific locations with incredible accuracy.
I read this crazy story, I think it was in one of those articles you sent, about honey fraud. They used pollen analysis to prove that honey that was being sold as locally sourced had actually come from get this, a totally different continent.
Isn't that wild? It just goes to show you how pollen can expose a lie, you know? In that case, they had mixed a little bit of local honey with imported stuff, hoping to fool people. But the pollen, it told the real story where the honey had actually come from. Busted.
It's just mind-blowing to me that something so tiny, something most of us would never even notice, could be the key to cracking a case wide open.
Mm.
But there's a catch, right? Pollen analysis, it's destructive, so it's not something they use lightly.
You're right. It's not like some of those other techniques where they can just, dust for fingerprints and get the evidence without damaging anything. With palynology, they usually have to destroy at least a little piece of the evidence, whether it's fibers from clothing or a soil sample. So yeah, it's usually saved for those situations where they've tried everything else, or when the information they might get from the pollen is just too important to risk losing it.
So we've talked about, the physical traces someone might leave behind. But what about mapping their movements, understanding their patterns? That's where geographic profiling comes in, right? It's almost like taking that idea of a criminal's MO, but then adding this whole other layer of, spatial awareness.
You got it. It's really interesting how criminals, even the ones who think they're acting randomly, often have these patterns to their crimes. And geographic profiling, it helps us understand those patterns, connect them back to how the criminal sees their environment, their own mental map, so to speak.
I remember one of those sources mentioned criminals often operate within what they called awareness spaces. What exactly does that mean?
Okay, so picture it like a web, right? A web of all these different locations that are familiar to the criminal, their home, their work, the routes they always take, even places they visit a lot. These places, they make up the criminal's mental map and influence how they see risks and opportunities. And within that awareness space, certain areas become what we call victim-target networks, which is kind of scary when you think about it.
Okay, victim-target networks definitely sounds ominous, but I think I'm getting it. It's about making those connections, seeing how the criminal's mental map overlaps with the routines of potential victims.
Bingo. By looking at the victim's activities, the routes they take, even their social connections, investigators can pinpoint those hot spots where a perpetrator might cross paths with a victim within their awareness space. It's a sad truth, but it often comes down to a combination of geography, psychology, and opportunity, all converging at the worst possible moment.
So we've been talking about how investigators can analyze a criminal's movements and patterns out there in the real world, but you also included some sources about cybercrime. And it got me thinking, can we use those same profiling techniques to understand, the digital trails that hackers and online criminals leave behind?
You're hitting on a really important point because the world of forensic science, it never sits still, right? It's always evolving, always trying to keep up with the latest technology. And just like geographic profiling helps us understand a criminal's movements in the physical world, analyzing their digital footprint, it's crucial in the virtual one. Think of it like this.
It's like a whole other world to investigate with its own language and rules.
Right.
I was reading about all the different types of cyber criminals, and I was like, wait, I thought hacker was the only term.
Yeah.
You've got hackers, then there's freakers, even something called telepirates. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
You're telling me. It's a complicated world, even for those of us who deal with it every day. But those sources you shared, they actually do a great job of breaking it all down. Like you said, hackers, they're usually motivated by the challenge, Can they get into the system? Can they bypass that security measure? It's almost like a game to them, a way to prove themselves within that community.
Right. And then there are the freakers. These are the ones who are all about messing with telephone systems, right? It's kind of nostalgic in a way. It reminds me of those old movies where they'd use those little boxes to make free long-distance calls.
Exactly. And while it might seem like phone freaking is a thing of the past, the truth is those techniques, that knowledge, it still informs some of the more sophisticated cyber attacks we see today. So, don't let the low-tech vibe fool you. It's serious stuff.
And then you've got the telepirates. It sounds kind of funny when you say it out loud. I'm guessing the reality of software piracy is anything but a laughing matter.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Telepirates, they're all about illegally sharing copyrighted stuff like software, movies, music, you name it. And it's a massive problem. We're talking billions of dollars in losses every year for companies and artists. But, all of this just goes to show how those lines between the physical and digital world are getting blurrier and blurrier, especially when it comes to crime.
It's really incredible when you think about everything we've covered in this deep dive. We started talking about the psychology behind investigations.
Yeah.
Then those unexpected tools like archaeology and pollen analysis. And now we're here in the world of cybercrime. It's obvious that forensic science, it's not just about like dusting for fingerprints. It's this constantly evolving field, always adapting to keep pace with us humans,
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And if there's one thing I hope people take away from this, it's the importance of approaching everything, even everyday stuff, with that same sense of curiosity that drives forensic science. Like we've seen, the most fascinating insights often come from those unexpected places, where different fields overlap, where those old ways of thinking are challenged. And who knows what we'll discover when we do that.
It's true. It's like we're piecing together a giant puzzle, but those pieces, they keep changing shape, and every time we think we've got it figured out, bam, there's a new connection, a new twist to the story. Well, it's been fantastic digging into all of this with you, and for you, dear listener, I hope this deep dive has you thinking twice the next time you watch a crime show on TV. And hey, maybe you'll even start noticing those hidden connections, those little details in your own life that you never paid attention to before. After all, the most intriguing mysteries, they're often right in front of us, just waiting for someone to look a little closer.